Welcome back to the deep dive. This is where we take those complex sources you share, cut through all the noise, and really get to the core of what you need to know to be properly informed.
Yeah, we act as your guides, you can say. We navigate the dense stuff, connect the dots between the ideas presented,
Yeah.
and pull out the most significant points so you can grasp these often complex subjects pretty quickly.
And today, wow, we're diving into something really significant. It's about the profound value, the fundamental nature of human life itself. We're looking at it through the lens of a specific landmark document from the Catholic Church published back in the mid-1990s.
Right, and this isn't light reading by any means. It's a really deep exploration. It confronts modern challenges to human dignity, head on. It outlines a pretty stark vision of current threats, and it calls for, well, a massive cultural shift.
So our mission for this deep dive is pretty clear. We're going to systematically unpack the central arguments of this specific document. We want you to come away with a really clear understanding of its particular perspective on life's value, the dangers it sees, and the kind of response it's calling for. It's about giving you the tools to engage with these ideas based directly on what the source actually says.
And that's the key point, isn't it?
Yeah.
Our discussion is going to be rooted solely in the content outlined from this specific document. We're here to understand its viewpoint, not inject our own.
Okay, let's get into it then. So the source document, it kicks things off by laying down this really striking theological foundation for the value of human life. It anchors everything in Jesus' words from the Gospel of John. I came that they may have life and have it abundantly.
And that opening quote, it's not just, a nice sentiment. According to this source, it's the absolute bedrock for understanding its entire argument. The document explains that this abundant life Jesus talks about, it's way more than just like biological existence on earth. It's described as a new and eternal life. And it's deeply rooted in a relationship, a communion with God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. That's the core idea.
So the source is making this really foundational claim, which might actually be surprising for some listeners. It's saying that because every human being is called to this supernatural, eternal destiny, this abundant life with God, their earthly life, life right here, right now, it gets infused with this incomparable worth and inherent greatness.
Exactly. The document sees our time on earth not as some isolated phase, but as, let me get the phrasing right, the fundamental condition, the initial stage, and an integral part of this single unified process, a process of human existence that's ultimately pointed toward the full eternal realization. It even pulls in scripture, like 1 John, pointing towards a future where we shall be like him, for we shall see him as he is.
That connection is crucial. Earthly life matters profoundly because of where it's headed, according to this view.
Precisely. And the source is quite careful here. It clarifies that this doesn't mean earthly life is the ultimate be-all and end-all reality. It's described as relative compared to the eternal. But, and this is the key, precisely because it's the starting point and an integral part of that ultimate journey.
It becomes sacred.
It becomes a sacred reality entrusted to us. That's the phrase used. So this life isn't just ours to, do whatever we want with. We have a responsibility, a sacred duty almost, to preserve it and, interestingly, to perfect it.
How does it say we perfect it?
True love, primarily. And through the sincere gift of ourselves, giving ourselves to God and to others. It draws on biblical images here, like Genesis 2, God breathing life into man, and also texts from wisdom, reinforcing this connection to a divine origin and, well, a divine purpose.
That framing is really powerful, isn't it? It immediately lifts the whole discussion beyond just biological value or social utility. It grounds the dignity of every single person right now in this eternal context. It's suggesting the value of your life today is tied to something transcendent.
It completely shifts the axis. Human dignity, in this view, isn't something you earn or something based on your abilities or function. It's inherent, simply because of this divine origin and destiny the source describes.
And this theological foundation leads straight into the source's exploration of the concept of man being created in the image of God. Now, that's a familiar idea, but how does this specific document unpack what that means for the value of life?
It really digs into it, referencing Genesis and Psalms. It argues that being made in God's image means humans are uniquely a manifestation of God in the world. We are like a sign of his presence, maybe even a trace of his glory.
Wow, a trace of his glory.
Yeah, and it underscores this point by quoting an early church father, St. Irenaeus, who famously said, living man is the glory of God.
So being made in God's image isn't just some abstract label in this document. It means we uniquely reflect God within creation, and it's that reflection that gives us this sublime dignity and creates this intimate bond with the Creator.
Exactly right. The source connects this image-bearing status, not just to a general kind of dignity, but to very specific capacities that set humanity apart. It highlights attributes drawn from Scripture, things like having dominion over the world, possessing spiritual faculties like reason, the ability to discern good from evil.
Free will, too.
Free will, absolutely.
Yeah.
And fundamentally, it emphasizes our unique ability, among all visible creatures anyway, to know and love His Creator. That point is drawn directly from a Second Vatican Council document called Gaudium et Spes.
And I thought it was fascinating how the source uses that other creation account from Genesis 2, where God breathes life into Adam.
The Yahwist account, yeah.
Right. It uses that to explain something really relatable about being human, that feeling of restlessness, of dissatisfaction we sometimes have. The source argues this feeling, this sense that something's missing. It's actually because we're made by God and we carry His imprint. We're just naturally drawn towards God. It even weaves in that famous line from St. Augustine.
Our hearts are restless until they rest in you.
Exactly. It uses that restlessness as kind of evidence of our transcendent nature, proof that we're not just biological machines, but we have this spiritual core that yearns for something beyond the material, ultimately, for that communion with God.
And that's why, according to the source, life has this incomparable worth. It's the vessel, you could say, for this divine image and this eternal calling.
Okay, so that really establishes the source's incredibly high view theologically, philosophically, of the value of every single human life. But then the document takes a sharp turn, doesn't it? It shifts dramatically to confront the reality of, well, threats to life in the modern world. And the picture it paints is much darker.
It is. It certainly acknowledges the traditional threats, the scourges that have always plagued humanity, poverty, hunger, disease, violence, war. Those aren't new. But the source expresses this deep, urgent concern about new threats it sees emerging on an alarmingly vast scale.
And it links these new threats to progress.
Largely, yes. To misapplied scientific and technological progress. That's a key point in Section 3 of the document.
And the source uses strong language here. It actually repeats a condemnation from that same Vatican II document, Gaudium et Spes, listing things opposed to life itself, murder, genocide, abortion, euthanasia, suicide, and anything violating the integrity of the human person.
Right. And the source contends this disturbing situation isn't just static or contained somewhere. It argues it's actively expanding.
Yeah.
It says the current cultural climate allows these actions against life to take on a new and, if possible, even more sinister character.
More sinister? Why more sinister, according to the source?
Because the source claims large segments of public opinion now justify these actions, often in the name of individual freedom. And it's not just about avoiding punishment anymore. The source says people are demanding state authorization, even support from healthcare systems for these acts. That's laid out in Section 4. And this is really where that central concept comes in, the culture of death.
Let's unpack that phrase, the culture of death. That's obviously very provocative, very central to the source's critique. What exactly does the document mean by that term?
Okay. The source defines this culture as being fundamentally characterized by a denial of solidarity, especially solidarity towards the weakest members of society. And it argues it's actively promoted, not just happening randomly, but pushed by powerful cultural, economic, and political currents.
And it mentions a specific motivation driving these currents.
Yes, it does. It says these powerful forces are excessively concerned with efficiency. That's from Section 12.
Efficiency keeps coming up, doesn't it?
It does. And the source argues that this obsession with efficiency, when it gets detached from a grounding in human dignity, leads to a really brutal outcome. What it calls a war of the powerful against the weak.
A war.
That's the term used. In this kind of culture, life that requires significant care, maybe because of age, illness, disability, starts to be viewed as useless.
Yeah.
Or maybe just an intolerable burden. And if something is seen as a useless burden, well, the next logical step within that efficiency mindset, according to the source, is to reject it or even eliminate it. Again, that's Section 12.
That's chilling. The idea that if you're vulnerable, if you inconvenience someone else's comfort or their productivity, you essentially become an enemy.
The source illustrates it very starkly. It says a person who compromises the well-being or lifestyle of those who are more favored tends to be looked upon as an enemy to be resisted or eliminated. It frames this as a cold calculation based purely on utility rather than inherent worth. And the source broadens this critique too. It talks about a conspiracy against life.
A conspiracy. That sounds quite strong. Who's involved in this conspiracy, according to the text?
It casts a wide net. It includes individuals, certainly families, specific groups. But the document also explicitly points fingers at international institutions, and notably it mentions the mass media quite specifically in sections 12 and 17.
How does the source see the media playing a role in fostering this culture of death?
Well, the source claims the media often plays a pretty significant role by kind of framing certain practices in a positive light. It says they lend credit to things like contraception, sterilization, abortion, even euthanasia, presenting them to the public as symbols of progress or freedom.
While at the same time?
While at the same time, according to the source, positions that unequivocally defend life are often portrayed negatively, depicted as being, hostile to freedom, enemies of progress. That's the argument in section 17.
So the source isn't just saying the media reports facts. It's arguing the media actively shapes the narrative, normalizing certain actions against life and marginalizing voices that oppose them. The document then tries to dig even deeper to find the ultimate root cause of this culture of death. It identifies it as an eclipse of the sense of God and of man.
Yes, this is presented as the absolute fundamental cause. The source specifically points to secularism as a major driving force behind this eclipse, this dimming, in section 21. The core argument it makes is essentially cause and effect. When humanity loses its sense of God, when God is forgotten or pushed out of the public square, there's a corresponding, almost inevitable tendency to lose the true sense of man, to forget human dignity, and ultimately to devalue human life.
And it connects this to morality, too.
It does. The source adds the systematically violating fundamental moral law, especially laws protecting life, further darkens the human capacity to even perceive God's presence. It actually quotes Gaudium as Spes again here. Without the Creator, the creature would disappear, but when God is forgotten, the creature itself grows unintelligible.
That's a really powerful connection being made. Forgetting God isn't just like a theological oversight in this view. This document is saying it directly results in us failing to understand who we are as humans, and that failure has devastating consequences for how we treat life.
Exactly. The source argues that when God is forgotten, humans start to see themselves not as bearing a divine image, but merely as an organism, reduced to, quote, a thing, among other things. That's section 22. And this means losing what it calls the transcendent character of human existence, that spiritual dimension, the eternal calling we talked about earlier.
So life itself becomes just property.
Life becomes something to be controlled, manipulated, treated as mere property that can be disposed of. Even profound human experiences like birth and death, instead of being things to be lived through, are reduced to technical events, things to be possessed or rejected using technology. Again, section 22 outlines this shift in perspective.
This perspective sounds like it's describing a society where the inherent mystery, the dignity of human existence, is just stripped away, leaving only the material reality.
That's precisely the source's deep concern. It connects this whole eclipse to what it labels practical materialism. Now, this isn't just about owning stuff. It's a worldview where material reality is basically all there is, or all that matters. And this materialism, the source argues, inevitably breeds other things. Individualism, where the self is supreme, utilitarianism, where value is judged only by usefulness, and hedonism, where pleasure becomes the highest good. That's all in section 23.
So the values of being who a person is, their inherent worth, get replaced by values of having or doing.
Yes. The source contends that in this view, quality of life gets defined almost exclusively by external factors, things like economic efficiency, consumerism, physical pleasure, while neglecting the much deeper defining dimensions of human existence, interpersonal relationships, the spiritual side, the religious dimension, and the direct result of this, according to the source, the supremacy of the strong over the weak, because the weak, the unproductive, the burdensome, they're just seen as inefficient things.
Okay, so this culture of death, as the source defines it, isn't just some abstract concept. It manifests in very concrete actions that the document condemns in the strongest terms. Let's look at how the source discusses some of these, maybe starting with procured abortion.
Right. The source is absolutely unequivocal here. It calls procured abortion an unspeakable crime, directly quoting that phrase from Gaudium et Spes. And it lists specific characteristics that it says make this act particularly serious and deplorable. That's section 58.
But as the source itself notes, there's this disturbing reality that its gravity seems to have become obscured in many places today. It's gained acceptance in the popular mind, even enshrined in law sometimes.
The source sees this widespread acceptance as a profound sign of a crisis in the moral sense of society. It's highly critical of what it calls ambiguous language used to talk about abortion, like interruption of pregnancy. It argues such terms are deliberately used to, quote, hide its true nature and decrease its gravity in public opinion. Again, Section 58. The source insists on absolute clarity.
And its definition is crystal clear.
Completely unambiguous. It defines abortion as the deliberate and direct killing of a human being in the initial phase of his or her existence, extending from conception to birth. That's the definition given in Section 58.
And the source goes on to emphasize why it considers this act so gravely evil from its perspective.
Yes, it details the reasoning. The victim being eliminated is, 1, at the very beginning of their life, 2, absolutely innocent, 3, utterly defenseless, and 4, is not an aggressor in any conceivable way. The source also points out the particular tragedy when the decision is made by the mother, to whom the unborn child is entirely entrusted for protection.
Now, the document does acknowledge the often very difficult circumstances that can surround these decisions for the mother, doesn't it?
It does. The source recognizes that these decisions are often tragic and painful, and don't always stem from, purely selfish motives. It notes that the decision can arise from pressures related to the mother's health, maybe serious concerns about the living standards for the rest of the family, or perhaps fears about the potential difficulties the child might face if born into challenging circumstances. All mentioned in Section 58. However,
There's a big
a very big one. The source is absolutely firm, stating that these reasons, no matter how serious or tragic they might seem, can never, ever justify the deliberate killing of an innocent human being. That's the line drawn in Section 58. From this perspective, it's seen as taking one innocent life to try and solve a problem, which is deemed unacceptable.
And the source also makes it clear that the responsibility for abortion doesn't rest solely with the mother.
Oh, far from it. The source meticulously lists a whole range of parties it holds responsible, making it very clear that it views this as a social crime, not just an individual one.
Who does it include?
It includes the father, especially if he puts direct pressure on the mother, or, conversely, just abandons her to face it alone. It includes wider family members and friends who might exert pressure. It includes medical staff, doctors, and nurses who perform the procedures, legislators who vote for or actively promote laws permitting abortion, healthcare administrators who facilitate these procedures.
It goes even broader than that, right?
Yes, it points to those who cultivate a culture of sexual permissiveness or a lack of esteem for motherhood, those who fail to provide adequate social and family support policies that could help women choose life, and even international institutions that campaign for the legalization and promotion of abortion globally. All these parties are seen, in Section 59, as participating, to varying degrees, in a shared social responsibility for this act.
And underpinning this strong condemnation is the source's fundamental view of the status of the unborn child.
Absolutely central. The source states very clearly, from the very first moment of existence, the result of human procreation must be treated as a person. And this means recognizing their inviolable right to life.
How does it ground that claim?
It grounds it in a few ways, as laid out in Section 60. First, reason, arguing it's the most logical conclusion when biological science clearly shows a new, distinct human organism has begun its development. Second, probability, arguing that even if there were some theoretical doubt about personhood, the moral obligation must be to err on the side of protecting life. And third, the long-standing tradition of the Church.
And it connects this back to Scripture and that tradition as well.
It does. Section 61 acknowledges that the Bible doesn't have like a specific verse condemning abortion in modern legal terms, but it argues that the deep respect shown for life in the womb throughout Scripture, think of Psalm 139, or prophecies like Jeremiah's calling from the womb, implies that the fundamental commandment, you shall not kill, naturally extends to the unborn child.
And tradition.
It highlights early Christian tradition, mentioning documents like the Didache and church fathers like Tertullian, who strongly condemned abortion. The source emphasizes that the consistent teaching of the Church's magisterium, that's its official teaching authority, has always reaffirmed this condemnation. It also adds in Section 62 that canonical penalties within the Church, like excommunication for those directly involved, aren't primarily meant as punishment, but more to signify the extreme gravity of the act within the Church's own life, and to urgently call for conversion and repentance.
The source really stresses that this particular teaching is fixed, doesn't it?
Absolutely. It declares this doctrine is unchanged and unchangeable. It states that direct abortion is always a grave moral disorder. Why? Because it is the deliberate killing of an innocent human being. And according to the source, no circumstance, no purpose, no human law can ever make such an act morally licit or acceptable. That's section 62.
And it extends this condemnation beyond surgical abortion.
Yes. Section 63 explicitly includes any intervention on human embryos that inevitably leads to their death, even if the stated purpose is otherwise considered legitimate, like scientific research or obtaining biological material for therapies. That's also condemned under this principle.
The document also touches on the issue of prenatal diagnosis. What's its take there?
It draws a distinction. The source says prenatal diagnosis can be morally licit, acceptable, if its purpose is therapeutic identifying medical treatments needed for the child while still in the womb, or maybe preparing the parents emotionally and practically for the child's specific condition after birth, provided, of course, that the diagnostic procedure itself doesn't pose disproportionate risks to the mother or child. That's in section 63.
However.
Yes, the source expresses very serious concern that, quote, all too often it becomes an opportunity for proposing and procuring an abortion. This is what the source specifically labels eugenic abortion.
Eugenic abortion, based on the idea that a life is only acceptable if it meets certain standards of, say, normality or predicted well-being.
Exactly. And the source condemns this mentality in the strongest terms. Shameful and utterly reprehensible. It argues that this mindset, which accepts life only if it meets certain conditions, dangerously opens the door wide to legitimizing infanticide and eventually euthanasia for anyone deemed substandard. That's the argument in section 63.
It contrasts this with lived experience.
It does. It contrasts this eugenic mentality with the actual lived experience of many individuals with disabilities who, when they're surrounded by love and adequate support, demonstrate the inherent value and profound capacity for fulfillment that life holds, even amidst significant challenges. The source sees this as exposing the fundamental fallacy of the eugenic mindset.
Okay, moving to the other major act condemned alongside abortion in the document, euthanasia. How does the source define and discuss that?
The source defines euthanasia straightforwardly as a grave violation of the law of God. More specifically, it calls it the deliberate and morally unacceptable killing of a human person. That's the core definition in section 65.
And the source identifies the specific moral malice involved.
Yes. It states that euthanasia always involves the malice, proper either to suicide, if the person consents or requests it, or to murder, if it's imposed upon them.
Let's touch on suicide first. How does the source view that?
The source views suicide itself as always morally objectionable. It calls it a gravely evil choice. Why? Because it's seen as a rejection of proper self-love, a violation of duties of justice and charity owed to others in the community, and most fundamentally, a rejection of God's absolute sovereignty over life and death. That's section 66.
Does it make any allowances for circumstances?
It does add a note of nuance. It acknowledges that severe psychological factors, emotional distress, or debilitating circumstances might lessen the subjective responsibility of the person committing suicide. But importantly, it says this doesn't change the objective immorality of the act itself.
And it considers euthanasia even more serious when it's committed by others, like murder.
Yes. The source argues that euthanasia committed by others, particularly those in positions of trust or authority, reaches, quote, the height of arbitrariness and injustice. This is seen as especially true when people, and it specifically mentions physicians or legislators, arrogate to themselves the power to decide who ought to live and who ought to die. Section 67 draws a direct parallel here to the temptation in the Garden of Eden, the desire to usurp God's role.
And what does the source see as the consequence when humanity tries to take this power?
The source contends it inevitably leads down a path of injustice and death. When society permits some individuals to decide whether others should live or die, the life of the weak and vulnerable person is literally placed in the hands of the strong. The source argues this fundamentally undermines the very basis of justice and destroys the essential foundation of mutual trust, which it sees as absolutely necessary for any authentic human community or healthy interpersonal relationship. That's the core of the argument in Section 67.
So for the source, these major issues, abortion, euthanasia, the thinking behind eugenics, and this underlying materialism and secularism, they're all interconnected. They're manifestations of this broader culture of death. And the document seems to trace the root of this, not just to big societal structures, but right down to a problem within individuals, too.
Absolutely. The source talks about a central eclipse happening not just out there in the public sphere, but deep within, in the very heart of the moral conscience. And it says this affects both individuals and society collectively. Society itself, the source insists, bears a significant responsibility for tolerating and sometimes even actively fostering attitudes and behaviors that are contrary to life. That's Section 24.
And the danger it identifies here, it's described in pretty stark terms, isn't it?
Very stark. The source warns of an extremely serious and mortal danger. What is it? It's a profound confusion between good and evil, specifically concerning the most fundamental right of all, the right to life. When conscience, both individual and social, becomes so darkened, so confused, that it starts calling evil good and good evil, particularly about something as basic as the right to life. Well, the source says society is on a path towards the most alarming corruption and the darkest moral blindness. That's the warning in Section 24.
That really throws down a direct challenge to the listener, doesn't it? How do you, with your own moral compass, navigate all this? How do you discern the truth about life's value amidst this pervasive confusion that the source is describing?
Implicitly, yes.
Yeah.
The document is fundamentally calling for a reawakening, maybe a formation of that moral sense. And it insists that moral sense must be grounded in objective truth, not just shifting based on relativism or what seems useful at the moment.
And speaking of law and society, the source then moves into discussing the broader societal and legal dimensions of these issues. It notes something it sees as a major global contradiction.
Yes, it highlights what it perceives as a striking contrast. On one hand, you have all these widespread international declarations of human rights championing the dignity and rights of every person. But on the other hand, the source points to the tragic repudiation of these very rights in actual practice, especially when it comes to the weakest and most vulnerable members of the human family. That's Section 19.
How does the source analyze that contradiction? What's the specific danger it identifies there?
It argues this disconnect poses a direct and really significant threat to the entire culture of human rights. When the most fundamental right, the right to life, is systematically violated or denied legal protection, the source contends it fundamentally jeopardizes the very foundation and meaning of democratic life. Societies risk becoming not true communities of people living together in mutual respect, but collections of individuals where some are rejected, marginalized, uprooted, and oppressed.
And it extends this critique internationally.
It does. It questions the sincerity of human rights claims when, for example, wealthier nations link development aid to poorer ones with conditions promoting anti-procreation policies, which the source views as attacks on life, or when global economic models perpetuate injustices and violence that devastate lives and communities. All this is seen as part of that contradiction in Section 19.
Okay, the document then digs really deep into the complex relationship between civil law, state law, and moral law. It presents its very specific perspective on this.
It does. The source starts by emphasizing that civil law has a distinct and actually more limited purpose compared to the moral law. Its essential role, according to this document, is to ensure ordered social coexistence. To promote justice and peace within society, it even references 1 Timothy there. Civil law's primary function is to guarantee fundamental human rights. That's laid out in Section 71.
But it also draws a line.
It draws a firm line. The source states clearly that civil law cannot and should not attempt to substitute for the moral conscience, nor can it dictate norms or mandate behaviors that fall outside its proper competence, which is focused on that common good through protecting rights, ensuring peace, and public morality.
And the source is absolutely unwavering on what it sees as the first and most fundamental right that civil law is morally obligated to recognize and protect.
Without a shadow of a doubt, it identifies this as the inviolable right to life of every innocent human being. Again, Section 71. The source argues this right is the absolute prerequisite for all other rights. I mean, if you don't have the right to exist, what other rights could possibly matter? That's the logic presented.
So given that foundation, how does the source view laws that actually permit or even promote actions against this fundamental right, like laws allowing abortion or euthanasia?
This is a really critical point in the document. The source states that while public authority might sometimes find itself in a position where it has to tolerate a lesser evil in certain complex situations to prevent an even greater harm, It can never presume to legitimize an offense against the right to life as if it were somehow a right itself, even if a majority of the population happens to support it. That's a crucial distinction in Section 71.
And it addresses the argument about respecting conscience.
It does, directly. The source explicitly argues that any claim to base the legal toleration of abortion or euthanasia on respect for individual conscience or freedom is fundamentally misplaced. Why? Because, it argues, society has a positive duty to protect itself from abuses committed in the name of conscience or freedom, especially when the lives of innocent third parties are at stake.
This leads directly to the source's very strong assertion about laws that actually legalize the direct killing of innocent human beings.
Yes, the source declares unequivocally that civil laws, which legitimize the direct killing of human beings, for example, through abortion or euthanasia, are in complete opposition to the inviolable right to life. It argues they fundamentally deny the basic equality of all persons before the law. And therefore, according to the source, such laws lack any authentic juridical validity. That's Section 72.
Lack authentic juridical validity. What does that mean practically?
It means the source sees them as not being true laws in a moral sense. It argues that disregarding the right to life, especially by harming or killing the very individual society exists to serve and protect, directly conflicts with the common good. And consequently, such a civil law ceases by that very fact to be a true, morally binding civil law. It loses its moral authority to command obedience.
That's a really powerful claim, that a law violating the fundamental right to life essentially forfeits its moral authority.
It is. And flowing directly from that assertion, the source states that there is absolutely no moral obligation in conscience for anyone to obey such unjust laws. In fact, it argues the opposite. There is a grave and clear obligation to oppose them by conscientious objection. It even quotes the Acts of the Apostles here. We must obey God rather than men. That's Section 73.
So no obligation to obey. What else does it say about interacting with such laws?
It's very explicit. The source states it is never licit to obey it or to take part in a propaganda campaign in favor of such a law or vote for it. That's a direct quote within Section 73.
Okay, but the source does offer a specific point, a kind of nuance, for legislators who might find themselves in a difficult position, maybe grappling with laws that are already on books or seem likely to pass despite their personal opposition.
Yes, it provides guidance for those complex, real-world political situations which are obviously common in pluralistic democracies. It says if a legislator is personally opposed to abortion or euthanasia, and a law permitting these acts is already passed or seems certain to pass, and a complete repeal is just not politically possible at that moment, then that legislator can, licitly, morally acceptably, support legislative proposals that aim to limit the harm caused by the unjust law.
How does that work?
The goal is to reduce the negative consequences. For instance, supporting amendments that add restrictions or reduce access or protect conscience rights for healthcare workers. This is seen by the source not as illicit cooperation with the evil law itself, but as a legitimate effort to limit the evil it causes, when eliminating it entirely isn't feasible. That's the nuance in Section 73.
And on the general topic of cooperation with actions the source deems immoral, it provides some guiding principles for individuals too, right?
It does. Section 74 stresses what it calls a grave obligation of conscience for Christians, and indeed for all people of goodwill, not to cooperate formally in practices that are contrary to God's law, even if those practices happen to be permitted or even encouraged by civil law.
What does it mean by formal cooperation?
Formal cooperation means either direct participation in the immoral act itself or sharing the immoral intention of the person carrying out the act. This kind of cooperation, the source states, is never justified, regardless of appeals to personal freedom or the existence of permissive laws. The source wraps up this section by strongly reiterating the ultimate individual moral responsibility every single person has before God, stating that everyone will face judgment for their own personal actions.
This whole discussion about legal frameworks and individual responsibility then naturally leads into the source's call for political and social responsibility more broadly.
Yes, the source directs a really specific, quite urgent call towards civil leaders, legislators, anyone in a position of political power. It urges them to make courageous choices, particularly in implementing legislative measures that genuinely support and protect life. That's in Section 90.
Does it acknowledge the difficulty?
Oh, yes.
Ha!
It explicitly acknowledges the significant challenge this presents, especially in pluralistic democracies where you have deeply differing outlooks on these issues. But it insists that no one in such a position can simply abandon this fundamental responsibility. Legislators, the source notes, ultimately answer to God, to their own conscience, and to the whole of society.
And the source argues that just getting rid of unjust laws, while necessary, isn't actually enough on its own.
That's a key point. The source argues that merely repealing permissive laws is insufficient. You have to address and eliminate the underlying causes that lead people to attack life in the first place. And it identifies a primary way to do this, ensuring proper, robust support for families and for motherhood.
It sees family policy as central.
Absolutely central. The source makes a very strong claim here. Family policy must be understood as the fundamental basis, the driving force, really, behind all sound social policies. That's the argument in Section 90.
What kind of practical steps does the source suggest for putting this into action?
It suggests several things. Working to create social and economic conditions that truly support genuine freedom in choices about parenthood. It also calls for fundamentally rethinking and reorganizing things like labor policies, urban planning, housing arrangements, and social services. The goal: to help people harmonize their work schedules with family time, making it realistically possible for individuals to provide adequate care for their children, for the elderly, and for those who are sick or disabled.
And how does the source view the role of public authorities when it comes to population policies? That can be a controversial area.
It addresses it directly in Section 91. The source acknowledges that public authorities do have a responsibility to consider and potentially orient demographic trends. However, it places a huge non-negotiable caveat on this. Any such intervention must always respect the primary responsibility that belongs to married couples and families regarding decisions about procreation and education.
And certain methods are off limits.
Absolutely. Crucially, the source states that public authorities cannot legitimately employ methods that disrespect the person or violate fundamental human rights. It explicitly lists the encouragement or, worse, the imposition of contraception, sterilization, and abortion as morally unacceptable methods for trying to achieve population goals. Instead of those methods, the source argues that truly effective and ethical solutions to population concerns lie elsewhere. They lie in creating conditions that enable free and responsible choices by couples. They lie in promoting greater opportunities for all people, ensuring a more equitable distribution of wealth, and fostering a genuine economy of communion and sharing, both within nations and internationally. That's the alternative path laid out in Section 91. The source argues only this approach can truly respect the dignity of persons, families, and diverse cultural heritages.
Okay, so after outlining this whole landscape of threats, the critiques of culture, the societal and legal challenges, the document makes a definite pivot, doesn't it? It shifts towards offering a message of hope and outlining concrete ways people can respond positively. What signs of hope does the source actually identify amidst all the darkness it describes?
That's right. It's careful not to paint an entirely bleak picture. It specifically points to various signs of hope that it observes in contemporary society, things that counter the negative trends.
Like what?
Well, Section 25 highlights the generosity of families who willingly accept children, including those who might have special needs or disabilities. It points to individuals and whole communities who dedicate themselves to caring for the abandoned, the handicapped, and the elderly who might otherwise be forgotten. It mentions the vital work of life support centers, places that actively assist mothers facing difficult or unexpected pregnancies. And it praises the dedication of volunteers who help people in all sorts of distress.
So small acts matter.
Absolutely. The source sees countless daily acts of simple charity within families, in hospitals, in hospices, in various care centers as crucial rays of light. It explicitly likens these often hidden acts of selfless service to the actions of the Good Samaritan in the parable. It also points, in Section 27, to what it sees as a growing public sensitivity against the horrors of war and an increasing opposition to the death penalty in many societies, noting that modern society generally has the means to render criminals harmless without resorting to execution.
These examples seem to serve as direct counterpoint to that culture of death. And the overarching positive response the source calls for is building this new culture of life.
That's the central rallying cry, yes. It's the source's positive vision for transformation. It calls for nothing less than a general mobilization of consciences and a united ethical effort across all sectors of society. That's Section 95.
Why does it call it new?
The source explains it's new for a few reasons. One, it needs to specifically address the unprecedented challenges posed by modern science and technology that previous generations didn't face. 2, it needs to be embraced by Christians themselves with a deeper conviction and consistency. And 3, it needs to be capable of entering into courageous, open cultural dialogue with all people of goodwill, not just staying within religious circles.
And this whole effort, this building of a culture of life, it's grounded in the source's understanding of the core Christian mission itself, right?
Exactly. The source explicitly links building this culture of life directly to the fundamental mission of evangelization, of the proclamation of the gospel message. It references another papal document, Evangelium Vitae, stating that the gospel's inherent power is meant to transform humanity from within and permeate entire cultures. So, building a culture that respects life is presented here as an essential dimension of living out and sharing the Christian faith.
Where does the source say this vital work of renewing the culture of life must actually begin?
It emphasizes quite strongly in Section 95 that this work must start within Christian communities themselves. It calls for a serious examination of conscience within the church, asking questions like, how deeply has the culture of life truly penetrated the lives, the attitudes, the practices of believers? And identifying concrete steps Christians can take to serve life more effectively and consistently. It also urges open and serious dialogue on these crucial issues, not just internally, but with non-believers too, in various spheres of life.
And what does the source identify as the absolutely crucial first and fundamental step towards building this new culture?
According to the source, the most critical starting point, the absolute foundation, is the formation of consciences. This means actively helping people to understand, to internalize, and ultimately to uphold the incomparable and inviolable worth of every human life. That's Section 96. This formation has to be based on objective truth, enabling people to make sound moral judgments, not just follow feelings or trends.
The source also stresses the need to reestablish certain essential connections that it believes have been broken or dangerously obscured in the culture of death.
Yes, absolutely. It argues passionately for restoring the intrinsic, inseparable link between life and freedom. It calls them inseparable goods. The source states that both life and freedom find their deepest, truest meaning only when they're linked to love, and love understood specifically as sincere self-gift, not just sentiment.
And freedom needs truth.
That's the other crucial link it wants to restore, the essential connection between freedom and truth. The source argues that freedom detached from objective truth becomes rootless, rudderless, and ultimately dangerous. It can lead either to the arbitrary denial of fundamental rights or even descend into totalitarianism. That's the warning in Section 96.
So truth is presented as the necessary guide for freedom, and both are required to properly understand and truly value life itself.
And the source goes one step further. It contends that only by acknowledging our fundamental reality as creatures, recognizing our innate dependence on God as our creator, can human beings truly use their freedom fully and authentically. And only then can they genuinely respect the life and freedom of every other person. The document concludes this thought by arguing, quite powerfully, that the attitude a culture takes towards God is ultimately right at the heart of that culture's character. What you believe about God shapes everything else.
Okay, so beyond forming consciences and reestablishing these fundamental connections, the source outlines numerous practical ways that this service of life can actually be lived out day to day.
It places a really strong emphasis on what it calls the service of charity. But this isn't just, occasional good deeds. It demands profound consistency. It must be without bias, without exclusion or discrimination. It means actively showing care. That's a key word for all human life, but with a special, preferential love for those who are weakest and most threatened. That's Section 87. The source notes, quite proudly actually, that this profound call to love and care for life has historically been the driving force behind the Church's vast network of charitable works throughout history.
And the document provides pretty concrete examples of where this service of life is needed today and how it can be offered, doesn't it?
Yes, it gets quite specific in Section 88. It lists several key areas of action. First, providing support for new life. This includes things like centers that teach natural family planning methods, which the source frames positively as promoting responsible parenthood that values the whole person and the mutual gift of self between spouses. It includes marriage and family counseling services, seeing the family unit as the primary sanctuary of life, and it highlights the importance of assistance centers, or residential homes, for unmarried mothers or couples facing difficulties related to pregnancy and childbirth.
What about life facing hardship?
That's the second area, caring for life when it's lived amidst hardship. This includes establishing and supporting communities for those struggling with addiction, residential homes for vulnerable minors or those with mental illness, providing compassionate care for individuals suffering from diseases like AIDS, and creating associations that actively support persons with disabilities and help integrate them into society.
And crucially, the end of life.
Yes, that's the third area, providing truly humane assistance for the elderly and the terminally ill as they approach the end of their lives. The source emphasizes the crucial role of families here, but also social welfare services and, very importantly, palliative care. The goal is to alleviate suffering, yes, but also to address the profound human needs that often arise at this time, like anxiety, loneliness, and the need for human connection and spiritual support.
Education is also highlighted as absolutely vital for building this culture of life, isn't it?
Hugely important. The source calls for a patient and fearless work of education. It sees this not as a quick fix, but as a long-term, ongoing endeavor. It encourages people to genuinely bear one another's burdens, quoting St. Paul there. This includes promoting vocations dedicated to service, especially among young people, and committing to long-term projects that cultivate a deep-seated respect for life in the next generation.
Any specific educational topics mentioned?
Yes. Section 97 specifically mentions education in responsible procreation. The source frames this not just technically, but as learning obedience to God's plan for sexuality, respecting the biological laws written into the human person, and advocating for the use of natural methods of family planning, noting their increasing scientific accuracy. Education also involves helping people understand the deeper meaning of human suffering and death, seeing them not just as medical problems to be eliminated, but as integral parts of human existence that could be connected with love, have salvific meaning, and find their ultimate context in the Christian understanding of the Paschal mystery, the suffering, death, and resurrection of Jesus.
And the document calls out specific groups who have a particularly key role to play in all this educational and cultural work.
It does, in Section 98. It emphasizes the absolutely foundational role of families themselves in transmitting values about life. It highlights the crucial work of teachers and educators, especially in forming young people in concepts of true freedom and genuine respect for others. It acknowledges the important contribution of intellectuals, specifically mentioning Catholic intellectuals working in cultural centers and citing the Pontifical Academy for Life and various bioethics centers as examples. And, notably, the source once again calls upon the mass media.
What does it ask of the media this time?
It urges them to use their immense influence responsibly, to actively support the culture of life. This means presenting noble models of virtue, highlighting positive human values, actively avoiding anything that fosters contempt for life, and always striving to present factual truth with respect, sensitivity, and genuine humanity.
Finally, among all these practical and spiritual responses, the source makes this really fervent call for something deeply spiritual, a great prayer for life.
Yes, it really underlines the urgency of this prayer. It calls for it to rise up throughout the world, not just sporadically, but from every single Christian community, from groups specifically dedicated to defending life, from every family, and indeed from every individual believer. That's the call in Section 100.
And it connects this call directly to the actions of Jesus himself.
It does. It explicitly links this call for intense prayer and also fasting to Jesus' own teaching and example. It points to prayer and fasting as powerful spiritual weapons against the forces of evil, referencing his temptations in the desert and his instruction on driving out certain demons only through prayer and fasting.
What does the source see as the purpose, the power of this kind of global prayer?
The source contends that this widespread prayer and fasting are essential spiritual tools to help break down what it calls the walls of lies and deceit. The falsehoods, it argues, conceal the true evil nature of practices and laws that are hostile to life. Furthermore, it expresses a deep faith that prayer has the power to actually turn hearts, to guide people towards embracing the civilization of life and love that the entire document envisions.
So bringing our whole deep dive kind of full circle here, the document returns right back to its foundational theological point, doesn't it? Reaffirming the ultimate source of its hope.
It really does circle back beautifully. It comes back to the proclamation of Jesus. The source states, quite simply, that proclaiming Jesus is fundamentally proclaiming life, because Jesus is presented throughout the Gospels as the Word of life, the very embodiment of eternal life. That's Section 79. It reiterates that core idea. Earthly life finds its ultimate and full meaning precisely because it is destined for this eternal life, which the source, quoting John's Gospel again, defines simply as knowing God and Jesus Christ.
And throughout this whole complex document, the source maintains that the core doctrine it presents on life is, well, fixed,
Mhm.
unchanging.
Yes, it consistently asserts the unchanged and unchangeable nature of its teaching regarding the inherent value and sacredness of all human life, from conception to natural death. That's stated clearly in Section 62. And the core, unavoidable consequence of this teaching, according to the source in Section 81, is crystal clear. Because human life is sacred and inviolable as a gift of God, therefore practices like procured abortion and euthanasia are absolutely unacceptable, period.
But the document sees this message, this gospel of life, as it calls it, as having implications far beyond just individual belief or church practice.
Oh, absolutely. The source states very clearly that the gospel of life is meant for the whole of human society. That's Section 101. It argues that actively being pro-life, meaning working concretely to defend and promote human life in all its stages, is not just a religious stance or a private moral opinion. It is presented as a direct and essential contribution to the renewal of society itself, through the active promotion of the common good.
And it makes a very strong claim about the absolute centrality of the right to life for any society that genuinely aims for the common good.
It states this really forcefully towards the end. The common good of society cannot be truly fostered or achieved unless and until the right to life is defended as the foundation. Why? Because, according to the source, the right to life is the most fundamental of all rights. It's the indispensable bedrock upon which all other inalienable human rights are built. The document warns that any society lacks solid foundations, that its claims to value dignity, justice, and peace will ultimately ring hollow if it simultaneously devalues or violates human life, especially the lives of the weakest and most vulnerable among us.
And this leads directly to the document's ultimate, maybe most challenging assertion regarding the relationship between protecting life and core societal values like democracy and peace.
Yes, the source concludes with this incredibly powerful declaration. According to its perspective, laid out in Section 101, there can be no true democracy and there can be no true peace in any society unless and until human life, in all its phases and conditions, from conception to natural end, is genuinely respected, defended, and actively promoted. It even reinforces this point by quoting Pope Paul VI, who stated that any crime against life is, in its essence, fundamentally an attack on peace itself.
Wow. The document then wraps up by encouraging those who embrace this view, who it calls the people of life, to grow in number and commitment and to share this whole gospel message with gratitude and joy.
Yes, it calls for this message to be brought right into the heart of every person and integrated into every single facet of society. The goal is to actively foster that new culture of love and solidarity it envisions, as a positive alternative to the culture of death it critiques. It's really a call to actively build something positive and life-affirming.
And finally, the source includes a very specific, quite personal word directed towards women who have actually experienced abortion. It acknowledges the often incredibly complex factors, the difficult pressures, the profound pain that can be involved. And while it firmly maintains the source's teaching that the act itself is viewed as terribly wrong, it offers a very clear message of hope, of understanding, and specifically of divine mercy.
That's right. Section 99 urges these women, quote, "Do not give in to discouragement and do not lose hope." It encourages them to turn towards God, who the source presents as rich in mercy, for healing and forgiveness. It's a really notable pastoral counterpoint, offering a path towards reconciliation, right alongside the strong societal and ethical critique. It grounds the immense scope of the document's analysis in a call for individual healing and finding hope, even in the face of tragedy, directly within the framework of the source's overall message.
So we have taken a really deep dive into this significant document from the Catholic Church today. We've explored its foundational argument for the divine origin and the incomparable value it assigns to every human life. We've looked at its detailed critique of what it terms the culture of death and the underlying causes it identifies, like that eclipse of the sense of God and man. And we've unpacked its strong condemnations of specific acts like abortion and euthanasia, laying out its reasoning as presented in the text.
Yeah, and we've also dug into its perspective on the really complex interplay between civil law and moral law, its firm stance on unjust laws, and the corresponding call it makes for political and social responsibility. Alongside that, we explored its comprehensive outline for actively building a culture of life through forming consciences, through concrete acts of charity and service, through education, and through prayer. And we saw how it forcefully asserts that protecting life isn't just some peripheral issue, but is absolutely essential in its view for achieving true democracy and lasting peace.
This document clearly presents a powerful, internally consistent, and comprehensive framework for understanding the value of human life and the threats it perceives facing life today. It argues for nothing less than a radical shift in both culture and law, all based on its core theological and ethical principles. It really challenges us, doesn't it, to consider the very foundations of our society. Are they truly built upon a recognition of the inherent equal dignity of every single person, especially the most vulnerable?
And perhaps, as you reflect on this deep dive into the source's perspective, here's something to consider. The document argues, as we discussed, that the root of what it calls the culture of death is this eclipse of the sense of God, which then leads to an eclipse of the sense of man, ultimately reducing persons to things, valued mainly by their utility or the pleasure they provide. Where do you personally see this specific dynamic, this reduction of persons to things, this valuing of utility over inherent dignity playing out in contemporary debates or maybe in social structures around you, just as described by this particular source?
This deep dive is, of course, really just an entry point into what is an extensive and complex document. If the ideas and the arguments we've explored today, drawn directly from this source, resonated with you or sparked your interest, you might find it really valuable to explore the original text further on your own time.
Thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive into this important and challenging perspective on the value of human life.
Thank you for listening.